Hello, dear students. Let me just, scroll back through here. Apologies. Welcome to lecture 8, which is augmented feedback. Now, some of you would have seen some parts of this in week 0 when we looked at some concepts of augmented feedback. So you might be familiar with some of them, but we'll try to dig a little bit deeper into what augmented feedback is. And now that you know more about motor control and motor learning, a lot of these concepts should make a bit more sense. So what are we going to do? We're going to distinguish between task intrinsic and augmented feedback when performing motor skills. We're going to define knowledge of results and knowledge of performance and use some examples, which is a lot more difficult on a recorded session, but I'm sure you can simulate the guess. Then we can describe how augmented feedback can either aid or hinder learning, and in fact there's 4 different ways in which augmented feedback can affect learning. We're going to look closer at the difference between quantitative and qualitative augmented feedback and when augmented feedback should be provided. And on top of that, how much augmented feedback should be provided. And then finally, we'll look at some methods that can be used to reduce the amount of augmented feedback that we're going to give to learners. All right, let's get started. So first of all, now that we know that motor learning is the study of how someone progresses towards enduring performance capabilities, right? How does someone progress from beginner to more expert? And of course, we've put a lot of emphasis here on practice. We know that if you want to learn how to perform a motor skill, you start with very little background, and then you practice and ultimately you become better. Now, as a very important part of practice, something that you would have all experienced in or throughout your careers, both in school and in sport, you would have understood that receiving feedback can be really important in developing the ability to perform skills, right? If you would have gone through your year 1 to 6 without ever receiving feedback on any of your tasks, it is likely that your learning would have been greatly diminished. So we know that feedback is important when it comes to motor learning. And there's 2 types of feedback that we commonly use. There's task intrinsic feedback on one hand, and there's augmented feedback on the other. So task intrinsic feedback is all of the sensory perceptual information that's just a natural part of performing a skill, right? When you're trying to strap or when you're trying to tape someone's ankle, you are getting a sensory information that's proprioceptive information, tactile information, but you're also getting visual information on whether you're performing that skill correctly. And we've already talked about that in the last week, is that task intrinsic feedback is hugely important when learning motor skills. The ability to detect and correct your own errors is really important, and we do that by using sensory information. Now, sensory information isn't always available, or sometimes it's available, but it might not actually add anything to our learning, and then we can use augmented feedback. And augmented feedback is information about a performance that supplements or replaces sensory feedback. So for example, someone might get task intrinsic feedback from strapping someone's ankle, but you might get feedback from your teacher, let's say Hugo in some of your subjects, who tells you whether or not you've performed that skill correctly. Or you might get augmented feedback from your patient who says you've strapped it too tightly or it feels too loose, etc. So augmented feedback is actually quite important when it comes to motor learning because it helps to augment, right, to add to task intrinsic feedback. So, and feel free to pause the video here for a second if you want to think about it, but when you look at these 3 sports, right, biathlon and particularly the shooting part, we've got rally car, driving, and then we've got basketball shooting. Can you identify which types of task intrinsic feedback or augmented feedback are available in the following examples? And let's just do one together, right? When you're in a rally car, you get sensory information of how the rally car is behaving, right? that sensory information is called task intrinsic information. Of course, when you're in a rally car, you also get lots of information on things like tire pressure, maybe on whether the engine is overheating, etc. And all of that is augmented feedback because it supplements sensory feedback that you would get from executing the task itself. And as you can see here, there's quite an easy dichotomy that you can show between task intrinsic feedback or augmented feedback. Now, both task intrinsic and augmented feedback are forms of feedback. Task intrinsic feedback can be from any of the senses. Usually that comes from visual, auditory, proprioceptive, or tactile information. Of course, it can come from vestibular information or olfactory information as well, but it's less common. But what we're going to focus on is on feedback that comes from sources that are extrinsic to the performer. And these are called augmented feedback. And augmented feedback can either be knowledge of results or knowledge of performance. Now, knowledge of results is all the externally presented information, so all the augmented feedback that specifically focuses on the outcome of skill performance. While on the other hand, knowledge of performance is all the information that specifies movement characteristics that lead to the performance outcome. So knowledge of results is really about the outcome, while knowledge of performance is really about the process of how we achieve that outcome. Let's give some examples, right? Knowledge of results could be you've been given a certain score for your diving routine by a group of judges. However, knowledge of performance for that same diving routine might be your coach saying that the way you hit the water wasn't ideal. You hit the water at an angle, right? And because of that, you made a greater splash. So one is knowledge of results, and one is knowledge of performance. And these are generally quite easy to distinguish from one another. So just another quick example, which you can think about in your own time, is this an example of knowledge of performance or knowledge of results? A buzzer that gives tactile feedback when a knee angle is at 90 degrees in squat, is that knowledge of performance or knowledge of results? And when a swimmer sees an underwater replay of his or her arm movements during a race, is that considered knowledge of performance or knowledge of results? I know we've done similar exercises for those of you who were part of week 0, but obviously not all of you were part of that week 0 course that we did. And so those of you who weren't, you might want to think about this a little bit more. So what is the role of augmented feedback in skill acquisition? Well, we said that as a learner transitions from a beginner, right, into more expertful performance, what they do is they develop the ability to detect and correct movement errors. So as a result, when someone provides you with augmented information that supplements or replaces the information that is available from the skill itself, it can actually help you with that error detection and error correction. And as a result, it helps you achieve the skill goal more easily and quicker. For example, if someone tells you that following through when kicking for the posts in rugby is actually really important to get the ball to go in a relatively straight path, then that can help you to achieve more success. And remember, we said especially someone in the initial stages of learning needs to experience a certain amount of success to be able to engage in that trial and error type learning that is so characteristic of those early stages. Of course, augmented feedback can also help in motivating the learner, right? Because if a coach is providing you with information that you cannot actually get from the skill itself, that can be really powerful to help you to perform better. Also, right, imagine this. Imagine running 5 400s, right? And you wouldn't have a stopwatch available. You wouldn't really know whether one 500-meter run was faster than the others. As a result, you wouldn't really understand whether the mechanics of your running might have led to a faster or a slower performance. However, right, If someone actually has a stopwatch available, that can really motivate you if you receive knowledge of results that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get from task intrinsic feedback. That can really motivate you to perform better. Right? Someone who knows that they've run 45.02 seconds is much more likely to motivate themselves to go under that 45 seconds on the next 400 meters. Now, skill acquisition and motor learning researchers for decades have tried to answer the question, is augmented feedback essential? Right? Because early on, when studies on the relationship between sensory feedback and motor learning started, these researchers saw pretty quickly that sensory feedback is almost vital to be able to learn a motor skill. Right? You need to get some sort of task intrinsic information, and we've talked about that. It's really important to build really strong internal memory representations that you can use to match, or that you can use as a reference to match your performance to early in the stages of learning. So the question is, if task intrinsic feedback is so vital, what about augmented feedback? Is augmented feedback actually essential to learning? And there are 4 possible answers based on the skill characteristics and the personal attributes of the learner. And if you're interested in where those 4 possible answers come from, the author of your textbook, one of the authors, Richard McGill, wrote a study, well, not a study, but it's more of a review, a narrative review piece in 1994 that specifically outlines when augmented feedback can be beneficial or when augmented feedback can hinder learning. But let's take a look at the specific categories he outlined. What he said is that augmented feedback can be absolutely essential for skill acquisition. And that is specifically the case when task intrinsic feedback is either really, really difficult to interpret or really difficult to use. Right? Imagine someone shooting a sniper rifle. It is very difficult to actually see whether you've hit the target and where you've hit the target after you've shot a sniper rifle, because it might be that you're shooting at a target a kilometer away. As such, it is really useful to get information from a spotter on whether or not you've missed the target to the left, to the right, etc. And this skill is very difficult to learn in the absence of augmented feedback. The same with if you were a pace runner, right, during a race. If you, as a pace runner, wouldn't be getting any information on how quickly you were running your laps, either from your wristwatch or from your coach or in some other way, it would be very difficult to run or to run these laps at a certain pace, right? So some skills absolutely need augmented feedback in order to be learned. The same thing is when someone loses their eyesight, right? And they can no longer rely on task intrinsic information, especially because we know visual information is most important in performing motor skills. Augmented feedback might actually be beneficial, right? So getting augmented feedback in the beginning from someone who is helping you while you're relearning how to walk without visual information might actually be quite useful. A second category is that augmented feedback may not actually be needed for skill acquisition. And that is especially the case when task intrinsic feedback is abundantly available. So when task intrinsic feedback is really easily available, plus it's easily interpretable, then you don't actually need augmented feedback. If you're shooting 3-pointers, right, you can see whether the ball goes in the net or in the basket. Right? You don't actually need someone to tell you. So it might be that task intrinsic feedback is sufficient in order to learn a skill like shooting a basketball. On the other hand, or also the case, if we look at babies and infants and how they learn motor skills over their first year or their first 18 months, then we see that they actually don't need augmented feedback. Right? Because they learn to explore their world using solely task intrinsic feedback or solely sensory feedback. So in some cases, like we saw in the previous category, augmented feedback might be essential, But in other motor skills, augmented feedback is not actually needed. And that's especially when task intrinsic feedback is abundantly available. Augmented feedback can also enhance skill acquisition, right? We're not necessarily in this category, we're not necessarily saying that it's absolutely needed, but it can help accelerate skill acquisition. So in this particular study, Wallace and Hagler investigated how augmented feedback can enhance skill acquisition. And in this study, participants learned to shoot a basketball with one hand, which was the non-dominant hand. In this case, in other words, that means they were engaging in an entirely novel skill, right? So participants were engaging in a novel basketball shooting skill, and they were doing that either by receiving verbal knowledge of performance, right, which might be a coach who tells them how to perform better, or they were receiving verbal encouragement. And verbal encouragement is motivational, right? Come on, keep it up, keep going. That was a great shot, right? Something like that. So verbal encouragement. And what they saw was during the acquisition phase, especially early in the acquisition phase, verbal knowledge of performance and verbal encouragement were quite similar, or the performance benefits from both were quite similar. But then when they looked at a retention test, they saw that as a result of using verbal knowledge of performance, these participants doing the one-handed basketball shot had actually learned more when they received augmented feedback than when they just received encouragement. And that demonstrates that augmented feedback can actually be used to accelerate skill acquisition. Right? It's not necessarily needed because skill acquisition also occurred in the verbal encouragement group, but skill acquisition was faster, or the learning of a novel motor skill happened faster when verbal knowledge of performance was present. And then finally, the final category is that augmented feedback can also hinder skill acquisition, right? And that's quite important because when augmented feedback is provided really often to a learner, especially a learner early in the stages of learning, they might develop what's called feedback dependency. And that especially happens when task intrinsic feedback is either unavailable or really difficult to use. Because when it's really difficult to use, you automatically have to go to a source, to an outside source, right, to get augmented information on your performance. However, what we need to realize is that in many cases, in competition environments, that source of augmented feedback is actually not available. Imagine this, right? Imagine a gymnast who does a vault like here, or a particular jump or artistic routine, and after every single trial they are getting feedback from their coach on how they performed. These athletes might develop a feedback dependency, and as a result they will rely less on their ability to understand task intrinsic information, and they will rely more on the augmented feedback that supplements or replaces that task intrinsic information. However, that same augmented information is not available during official competition jumps. And as a result, the athlete might develop feedback dependency, which ultimately is detrimental to their performance. So in that case, augmented feedback can actually hinder skill acquisition. So when we give augmented feedback, what should we actually be providing to the learner, right? And there's 5 different issues that we're going to look at. We're going to look at, should we be providing information about errors versus information about correct aspects of performance? Is it more beneficial to give knowledge of results or knowledge of performance? Is it more beneficial to give qualitative or quantitative augmented feedback? What about if we give augmented feedback based on the size of the error that someone is making? And then finally, what happens if we are wrong? What happens if our augmented feedback is erroneous? So let's take a look at that a little bit more closely. When we look at should augmented feedback relate more to information about errors or information about correct aspects of performance, we can relate that back to what we know about how someone learns a skill. Someone learns a skill by gradually detecting and correcting their own movement errors. Right? So it seems logical that giving someone information about the errors they are making, as well as information about what they are doing correctly, can actually be beneficial for learning. But what we see, or what studies see, is that especially error information is quite effective for skill learning. So helping someone to detect their own movement errors can help in accelerating how quickly someone learns a motor skill. Of course, just like with other skills, providing too much information on the errors that someone is making can force them to only rely on your augmented feedback and no longer on their own task intrinsic feedback. So it can also hinder learning. On the other hand, if you provide more information on correct aspects of performance, you motivate the learner. Right? And we've all seen this. We've probably had coaches who focused more on what we did right and coaches who focused more on what we did wrong. And the question is, which one of the two is best? And it's very difficult to say. Of course, it's learner dependent, it's skill dependent, but never underestimate the value of providing augmented feedback on successful performances. Because if you can motivate a learner, the likelihood for them to want to learn more and engage in more learning is higher than when you provide only information on errors. But likely the best mix, or the best, is a combination of the two. Now let's take a look at knowledge of results versus knowledge of performance. Generally, it is assumed that knowledge of performance is better for skill learning in inexperienced players or inexperienced athletes. And these three authors in 1999 actually tried to investigate that. And they had a hypothesis, and they said that they assumed that athletes who were provided with knowledge of performance rather than knowledge of results would have more accelerated skill learning. So what they did was they had novel learners learn a volleyball serve. And they had one group, which was the first 4 subjects, that was provided knowledge of performance before knowledge of results on day 1, and then knowledge of results before knowledge of performance on day 2. And what they saw was that there was decreased performance on the second day, which they probably said was due to the interference caused of knowledge of performance on knowledge of results. And additionally, what they also saw was that their results didn't really show that if you were given knowledge of performance first before knowledge of results, that you actually performed better. So as a result, what these authors concluded in this somewhat convoluted study is that there's no real, even though we would expect knowledge of results, knowledge of performance to be more beneficial for inexperienced volleyball players or inexperienced learners of a volleyball serve, they couldn't actually find that in empirical data. Now, if you'd ask a coach would argument that knowledge of performance is really important early in learning while you're helping the learner find the best way of performing a motor skill. You're helping them to engage in that trial and error type method of learning. Later on in learning, learners don't really need to know about the process. If they just receive information about the result or the outcome, then they can figure out the process because they've developed more robust task intrinsic methods of feedback. So in a way, it makes sense to provide knowledge of performance early in learning and knowledge of results a little bit later. But the few studies that have been executed on that topic haven't been able to conclusively find evidence for that. Now, when is knowledge of results beneficial? Well, knowledge of results is really beneficial for learners when it confirms the assessment of task intrinsic feedback. If someone does a dive of the highest board and they used sensory information to figure out that they thought that they had a really good dive, and then they see the results from the jury and it confirms that they had a really good dive, it can be really beneficial to get knowledge of results because it allows the learner to understand that they've engaged in successful performance. Knowledge of results can also be beneficial when the learner can't actually determine the outcome of the skill performance based on task intrinsic feedback alone, right? And that is the case also in diving. You can't just figure out whether your dive was worth a 9 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10 just on task intrinsic information. So you need knowledge of results in some way. It's very important in getting motivation to continue to practice a skill. I've been running more lately, also because I'm fatter, just sitting at the kitchen table recording these lectures for you. And I've been running more, and if I wouldn't have knowledge of results from my watch telling me that I was gradually getting better, I wouldn't actually have the motivation to continue to practice. Knowledge of results also allows learners to engage in discovery learning or problem solving, because when you provide someone with knowledge of results, they still have to come up with which process led to them having that result, right? And it also allows learners to focus externally on the outcome of a skill rather than on the process, which we've already seen can be beneficial for the performance of a skill. Now, knowledge of performance can be beneficial when the goal is to acquire specific movement characteristics. If the goal is to dance gracefully, it is really important to know whether you're actually dancing gracefully. The process becomes the outcome, and it can be really important. It's also beneficial when complex movement coordination has to be improved or corrected for skill learning. Right? So when you're trying to relearn a skill or you're trying to correct a technical flaw, then knowledge of performance can be really beneficial. Also, when the goal of the action is to produce specific kinetic, kinematic, or muscle activity profiles, right? Getting information on knowledge of performance can be really beneficial there. Or when knowledge of results is redundant because there's enough task intrinsic feedback available. Now, should we be giving qualitative information or quantitative information? Qualitative information refers to the quality of performance without numerical values. For example, you were faster, you did better than last time, you had more amplitude in your movement. Quantitative information doesn't just tell you something about the quality of performance, but it also tells you something about the magnitude. You were 7 seconds faster. Your amplitude of movement was 5 degrees greater. Now, what we see is that early in learning, qualitative feedback is actually quite important. However, as you progress through the stages of learning, then quantitative augmented feedback becomes more important. And quantitative augmented feedback is more important later in learning because it gives you in the ballpark, because you already have in the ballpark information available, and now you need more quantitative information to further improve your performance. And that makes sense with what we know about learning. That qualitative information really can help early learners to detect and correct those large movement errors. While later on in learning, our feedback perhaps has to be a little bit more precise, and that quantitative feedback helps in detecting those smaller movement errors that we are making, because we are no longer making large movement errors. We've got a coordination pattern that's reasonably established. We just need to fine-tune it. We can also give feedback based on error size, and that's what's called the performance bandwidth method. And the performance bandwidth method, or the performance bandwidth technique, basically tells us that if someone makes an unacceptable error that falls outside of the bandwidth of acceptability that we're willing to accept, right, as a coach or an instructor, then we provide feedback. But if the error is acceptable or it's relatively small, then we provide no augmented feedback. This is obviously a very beneficial technique because by doing that, we're helping the learner, when they make large mistakes, we're helping the learner detect these large errors, which we know are really beneficial to improving performance. However, when they make small errors, we're forcing the learner to rely more on developing these task intrinsic methods of providing feedback, which we also know are hugely important in developing learning or learning a motor skill. Then what happens when we give feedback that is wrong? And you might not have thought about that before, but as a coach, and especially I have many friends who are, amateur coaches of their son or daughter's team, and they constantly talk to me. I don't think they know what I do for a living, but they constantly talk to me about how they are coaching their child's team in a particular way, right? And what I often hear from these people, and this is not just one person, it's multiple people, and not just people I know, but also coaches I see, coaches that I work with, etc. They feel that in order for them to be valued, they have to provide lots of feedback. They have to provide lots of information to their learners. However, what they don't know is that when you provide augmented feedback that is erroneous, right, that is incorrect, which happens very easily when you're a coach or an instructor, it is very easy to give erroneous augmented feedback. If you give erroneous augmented feedback, the learner listens to that feedback or uses that feedback even when it's redundant. If it's there, performers are going to use that. And we can see that in this particular study, which was an anticipation timing skill, right? And what we saw there was if you provide 3 or 4 different types of feedback, you provide either no knowledge of results, correct knowledge of results, or erroneous knowledge of results, or a mix of the two, then we see that when someone provides erroneous augmented feedback, then performance decreases massively, right? When you provide augmented feedback on someone's ability to anticipate in this timing skill, and you give them wrong knowledge of results, they actually start using that information to change their performance. And because they use that information, they're actually learning the skill in an incorrect way. And we can see that really clearly in this mixed group. This mixed group was given correct knowledge of results first, and they actually performed really well. But immediately when the study switched from correct knowledge of results to erroneous knowledge of results, performance was extremely affected. Right? That means that even when learners know how to do a skill differently because they've been instructed correctly, once you start giving them incorrect information, they actually start using that incorrect information and it affects their performance. So for all these coaches who feel the need to constantly provide augmented information, it is really important to think about the fact, is the information that I'm providing, the feedback I'm providing to my learners, am I 100% certain that that information is correct? If you are not 100% certain, it is sometimes better to say less. And I challenge you to do this as a study yourself. You can do it on yourself, although it's less beneficial there. But I would encourage you to find a keen bicycle rider and mess with the settings of their bike computer. And what you will see is, and studies have demonstrated this as well, is when you mess with the bike computer of these riders and you tell them that they are actually riding slower while they're actually riding faster, right? So the rider is riding 25 kilometers per hour. You mess with their computer and tell them they're riding 20 kilometers per hour. These riders actually ride a lot faster, right? Because everyone uses augmented feedback when it's available. Even when it contradicts task intrinsic feedback, we still rely heavily on that augmented feedback. Many people can't go running without a GPS watch, right? Or some coaches can't design a training session without relying on GPS values to tell them how much their players are running. We all become dependent on sources of augmented feedback, even when they are incorrect. Right, so which type of knowledge of performance exists? Well, there's verbal knowledge of performance, which is coaches' information, right? That can be prescriptive for beginners and more descriptive for advanced learners. And that coincides with what we talked about, the precision of the type of feedback that we're giving. Prescriptive information, where you're telling someone what they did wrong and how to correct that, and later on descriptive information for more advanced learners, where you're perhaps only telling them what they did right or wrong, and they have to come up with solutions on how to improve that. We can also give video feedback. That's also a type of augmented feedback. And then finally, we can give biofeedback. And biofeedback is, for example, information that we provide on someone's biological processes. Right? If you display someone's heart rate so that they, in the case of rifle shooters, so that they can pull the trigger in between two heartbeats, or they can deliberately slow down their heartbeat, that's what's called biofeedback, and it's also a source of augmented feedback. Biofeedback is very, very effective, extremely effective. If you show someone how much muscle activation they're generating, they are much better at controlling that muscle activation, but there's a huge dependency with biofeedback. There's a huge dependency on that biofeedback that develops if you use it too much. So watch out with using biofeedback. This is an example of a study that demonstrated the value of video feedback. And this is a study on golfing performance. Right? Let me just double check. Yeah, golfing performance. So these were moderately proficient golfers that were engaging in a golfing skill that was hitting a golf ball for both distance and accuracy. And there were three groups here. There's a control group, a verbal knowledge of performance group, and a video knowledge of performance group. The video knowledge of performance group received both information from an expert coach as well as video recordings of their own performance. The verbal knowledge of performance group received only information from a knowledgeable coach, and the control group, they could just hit as many balls as they wanted, but they didn't get any type of feedback. And it might be difficult to see the difference in colors, but the right-hand side is a video knowledge of performance group. And then compared to verbal feedback alone, video feedback and verbal feedback combined leads to better learning. The 2-week post-test is what we referred to as a retention test previously. So much more of that skill is retained after 2 weeks of no training when video feedback and verbal feedback were received by the learners. Then let's take a look at the timing of augmented feedback. When should we be giving augmented feedback? Well, there's two types of augmented feedback in that case, so two types of timings. There's concurrent feedback, where you give augmented feedback during the activity, and there's terminal feedback, where you give augmented feedback after the activity. Concurrent feedback is often related to a negative learning effect. If someone has to deal with augmented feedback while they are performing, not only should you know by now that saps a lot of our attentional resources or cognitive resources that we have available to perform a skill, but there's also the constant provision of augmented feedback that's not really realistic during a competition setting. So it might also develop some sort of dependency. Right? So when task intrinsic feedback value is low and augmented feedback value is high, concurrent feedback may actually lead to dependency on augmented feedback. For example, an orchestra is dependent on the musical director who provides constant augmented feedback on who has to play when. If you take away that musical director, the orchestra can no longer play. So concurrent feedback actually has a negative connotation in the motor learning domain. Terminal feedback is often used more frequently, and terminal feedback is what's used by coaches or instructors or physical therapists after an activity. So there's no research that supports the fact that you have to provide immediate feedback. A lot of coaches think that as soon as someone performs a skill, we have to give feedback straight away. But that's not actually the case. In many cases, it's actually beneficial to wait a little bit longer because a minimum amount of time is needed to convert that feedback into short-term memory, use it, and then perform a new trial. So that sort of memory consolidation phase actually takes time. And as a result, it might not always be beneficial to provide feedback straight after an activity. And we can look at a study by Anderson and colleagues that looked exactly at that. And this was a manual aiming task, which is very common in motor domains. So the learners were asked to aim using their hand, right? I can't remember exactly what type of aiming it was, but most aiming tasks are very similar. So they were aiming towards a target by using their hand, and they were either given immediate feedback, which is the delay 0 condition, or they were given feedback with a delay of 2, which means that they were given feedback on a particular trial 2 trials later. And what these researchers found is that the amount of error produced in this aiming task was lower when there was a greater delay in providing augmented feedback. And the interesting thing here is that during the actual practice trials, both methods were fairly similar. And that sort of justifies why coaches want to provide immediate feedback, because clearly you learn or you perform just as well, because there's no learning here. This is performance. It's a block of 10 trials. You perform just as well if you give someone immediate feedback or if you delay that feedback. But when we look at an actual retention test 24 hours later with no practice in between, we actually see that you learn a lot more when you've been given delayed augmented feedback. Then, how much augmented feedback should we be giving? What's the frequency of augmented feedback? And I implore you, if you've got Reese as your tutor, this is part of Reese's PhD at the Sydney Swans, where he looks at how much augmented feedback are coaches actually giving during drills, and how could that potentially affect performance. And if you've got Reese as a tutor, feel free to ask him about it. He'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. The historic feedback, or the historic vision, as I said before, because early studies in psychology and motor control a few decades ago argued that feedback is really important for learning, we sort of made the assumption that augmented feedback must also be important for learning. So therefore, the more augmented feedback that we give, the better the learner is going to progress, or the more the learner is going to learn. However, now we're coming back from that, and we're actually seeing that the frequency of augmented feedback is really dependent on the skill. And in many cases, giving more feedback is actually not beneficial, because we already saw continuous feedback or concurrent feedback may actually lead to an overload of information. It is very difficult to constantly listen to someone and at the same time also perform a highly demanding skill. All of you who've learned how to drive with your mum or dad was constantly trying to give you more information, know how difficult it is to do both of these things at the same time. Additionally, we've already said that if you give a lot of augmented feedback, especially while someone is performing a skill, it may actually lead to feedback dependency. So in this case, it might actually be better to give less feedback, because giving less feedback lets the learner to develop those those intrinsic methods of generating feedback from the task itself. So in this case, it lets them self-discover more about their learning or more about their performance, which will ultimately be more beneficial to their learning. So according to Salmoni and colleagues, the guidance hypothesis argues that augmented feedback helps a learner discover how to accomplish the goal of the task. And that's quite important, because if you constantly give augmented feedback, what you are doing is you are not helping the learner to discover how to accomplish the goal of the task. You are providing the learner with the solution already, and the learner no longer has to engage in any of that discovery type learning. So it's really important to think about the frequency of augmented feedback, not in the traditional model of the more feedback the better, but perhaps more in maybe providing augmented feedback all the time is not actually that beneficial to learning. In this particular study, Weinstein and Schmidt, which was again already 3 decades ago, right? Learners were asked to draw a really complex pattern on a computer screen, and they were provided either with 50% feedback, which was feedback on about 50% of the trials, or they were provided with feedback on 100% of the trials. So the frequency of feedback was doubled in one versus the other. And what you can see here is, again, during the acquisition block, both of these are actually fairly similar. So coaches or instructors who provide feedback all the time actually get the same effects during practice than coaches who provide augmented information or augmented feedback less often. But when we look at the actual learning, right, then we see that learners who have received augmented feedback in only 50% of the trials, they actually have a root mean square error score. In this case, we know lower is better. That is lower than learners who have received augmented feedback on all of their trials. So these studies, even though they're in quite discrete skills, or skills that might not necessarily be applicable to sport or even a rehabilitation setting, it does seem to indicate that providing more augmented feedback is actually not beneficial to the learner at all. In fact, decreasing the amount of augmented feedback you give could be beneficial to their learning. But how can we limit augmented feedback? How can we make sure that we don't provide too much augmented feedback? Well, one way of doing that is using the bandwidth technique that we provided before, because you only provide augmented feedback when the error is outside of an acceptable range. The other thing you could do is allow the learners to self-select on which trials they want augmented feedback. And for those of you who did the week 0 session with me, you would know that learners generally only ask for augmented feedback in about 20% of the trials where you would have otherwise given augmented feedback, which is a quite significant reduction if you ask the learner to self-select whether they want to receive augmented feedback. And another method that's been documented quite well in research is to use summary or average feedback after a certain number of practice trials. So what that would mean is, rather than having feedback after every single trial, you get feedback after trial 5 about the previous 5 trials, and you get some average sort of information, right? Let's say on the last 5 trials you were lifting your knees too high, something like that, right? And in this particular study, they looked again at an aiming task, and we remember in aiming tasks, the lower the error, the better. What they saw was that when someone was provided summary feedback after 15 trials, again, the learning was greater than when someone was provided feedback after every single trial, right? Which we can see here in the delayed retention test, which is a delayed amount of time after a learner has not practiced. The absolute constant error of this aiming task was actually lower for those who received summary feedback after every 15 trials than those who received feedback every single time, or who received summary feedback even after 5 trials. So that really demonstrates that decreasing the amounts of feedback we give may actually be beneficial for learning. Again, when we look at the actual practice performance, you can see here that the open square or the unfilled square, which is receiving feedback after every trial, yielded the best practice performance. And it again strengthens why many coaches and instructors and physical therapists want to provide augmented feedback after every single trial rather than spreading it out or providing summary feedback, even though ultimately the result for learning is much greater when you provide augmented feedback less often. Let's take a look at a few specific examples of how people, skill acquisition practitioners, have used augmented feedback in specific circumstances. In this particular study in gymnastics, a buzzer was placed on the trunk of a gymnast. You can see it here by the white dot in this visual representation. And the buzzer sounded every time the trunk leg flexion would be greater than 20 degrees, because we know, as part of the aesthetics of working on the pommel horse, right, as a gymnastics event, right, as well as in order to move around the pommel horse effectively, it's really good to stretch the legs. And believe it or not, I had to do all of this during my studies in physical education. We had to do pommel horse routines, etc. So I know how difficult it is to keep the legs stretched. So in this case, a buzzer would sound when the trunk leg flexion was greater than 20 degrees. And as a result, athletes who used this device showed performance improvements after 300 practice trials on a retention test, while a control group did not. And that demonstrates how augmented feedback can be used in a more complex gymnastics skill. Now, another skill has used augmented feedback on whole body fluctuations in speed and hand propulsive force. So what happens is sensors were placed on the swimmer that would provide the swimmer with information on how they were fluctuating in speed and how much propulsive force their hands were generating. That information was then provided to the swimmer using headphones. And as a result, these swimmers actually benefited from that biofeedback during training, and even 15 days later when that equipment was no longer available. However, again, we mentioned and you can imagine, if you do this type of training for too long, you become too dependent on having that information there, and you no longer develop the intrinsic mechanisms of feeling whether or not you have fluctuations in your velocity, or whether or not, or feeling how much hand propulsive force you're generating. Then in rowing, when rowers were provided with information on the position of the handle and the force that they were exerting on the handle compared to a template, and that's often done by projecting information on a screen while the rower is rowing, and also projecting the ideal angle force profile, that actually led to more work being done during an ergometer test. So if these rowers could mimic some sort of idealized coordination pattern for rowing, then they were actually producing more work. In netball, Helmer and colleagues used a strain stressor in a lycra sleeve, and that strain stressor gave auditory information when the elbow and the wrist were in a particular formation, which was beneficial to netball shooting. And as a result, what they saw was that they initially had poorer performance early in practice while learners were trying to get used to augmented information being available, but it eventually enhanced performance while shooting in a netball movement, a netball shot. And then finally, when a power snatch, or in a power snatch in trained university athletes, on a monitor, the bar path of each of the previous sets was displayed, and the learners received verbal augmented feedback on how to adjust to the desired bar path. they showed more performance improvements than controls who did not have that augmented feedback available. So that should demonstrate to you that augmented feedback has been investigated in the lab more often than not, but researchers have also attempted to take it out into the field into more complex skills. And clearly, augmented feedback can be beneficial for learning, but it's really important to understand when it can potentially benefit learning and when it can potentially hinder learning. So what did we look at today? Well, first of all, we looked at augmented feedback versus task intrinsic feedback. We specifically honed in on two types of augmented feedback that are commonly used: knowledge of performance and knowledge of results. We looked at how augmented feedback can help or hinder learning based on some characteristics of the skill and the performer. We also looked at what are some of the issues around providing augmented feedback, right? And we looked at what is the timing and the frequency of augmented feedback, and when or what type of augmented feedback should we be providing. We looked at a few different examples that use different types, verbal, video, or biofeedback, and use that in complex, more sport-specific skills to elicit some sort of learning. And we also know that augmented feedback should follow certain basic rules, right? Try not to use it too often. Try to allow the learner to also rely or develop their task intrinsic feedback mechanisms, and as such reduce augmented feedback where possible, but understand how powerful augmented feedback can be even when it's erroneous. All right, hope you all learned something. If you've got questions here, same as always, I'm giving you a few days. Write your questions down, and I look forward to getting them or receiving them from you before Monday at noon.